But first, it was only to be expected that losing the Aston by-election would trigger a new round of soul-searching and recriminations inside the Liberal Party, and that participants would be largely pushing their own barrows, such as the frequent Labor floor crosser, Tasmanian Liberal backbencher Bridget Archer, who's called for an end to ideological dog whistling, whatever that means. But let me come back to Archer in a moment. Victorian Liberal leader John Pizzuto, who must share some blame for the Libs' poor standing on Saturday after that botched two-week hit on one of his own more redeeming, on top of the Vic's horrific showing at last November's state election. Well, he says now that federal Liberals must reform, which is code, like Archer, for moving further to the left. Like Matt Keane and others, they call it moving to the centre, but it's the left. And for a party that's already too left, in my view, that's a shift to permanent opposition, rather than a place where a centre-right party like the Liberal Party can win elections. Now, on the specifics of Aston, there's no doubt whatsoever Saturday was a very bad day for the Liberals. You can't sugarcoat it. It was a dismal result. But if you've been around politics long enough, you'll know that political life has its seasons, bad as well as good. And it's how you get through the seasons that matters, which is why Aston needs to be kept in perspective as well as the right lessons learned from it. To those who think there was one killer factor in Aston that cost the Libs the seat, well, you're kidding yourself. You either don't understand Aston or you don't understand campaigning. There were many factors in the appalling Aston result. While Anthony Albanese keeps talking about voters hating conflict, Labor's campaign was entirely negative, damning Peter Dutton as the worst health minister in 40 years and attacking the Liberal candidate Rashina Campbell as the blow-in barrister from Brunswick. Fair enough, I am not one of those campaigners who cry over spilt milk. If Labor's campaign is negative, and it's hardly a surprise to me, it's almost always negative from Labor, but rather than whinge about it, the Liberals need to take it head on and counter a negative campaign. Now, that didn't happen. In an outer suburban seat where people are sick of being lectured to by inner city elites, the fact that Campbell was parachuted in hurt the Liberals. No ifs and buts, it was, in terms of a hit, as bad as when Labor tried to force Christina Keneally on the people of Fowler. Now, that's not to say Rashina Campbell is incapable. Absolutely she is. That's not to say she didn't work hard. She did. But Aston was never the right seat for her. And the fact that she was shoehorned in by the state executive, not picked by the local rank and file in a democratic pre-selection, well, that alienated the local party types she needed to be on the ground as her army. In talking to a number of key Liberals in Aston today, they said that a lot of the party members out there were largely on strike last Saturday. They felt disenfranchised. They needed to booth workers in to man booths from outside the electorate. And that reinforced Labor's message that Campbell wasn't one of them. As well, the Victorian Liberal Party's own goal over more redeeming, that whole mess with John Pizzuto in the fortnight leading up to the vote angered the strong bloc of conservative Christian votes in the electorate. Then there's the issue that the Liberals didn't have any announcements for the seat. Not one. Now, they campaigned against Labor scrapping 5 new roads for the area, but they didn't say they would put the funding back, that the roads would happen under a coalition government. They said she'd fight for the roads, not build the roads. Now, there's nothing else locally on offer to bring the people over on Saturday. Unlike the 2001 Aston by-election, that's the last time there was a by-election out there, the Liberals won on the single issue of a new Scoresby freeway. Then there was Alan Tudge's underestimated personal popularity. In 2019, the Liberal Party's 55% primary vote in Aston was 10% above its Senate vote in that seat. Now, that difference tells you that's a personal vote for the lower house member. And that Senate vote in Aston, I might add, was the highest in the state. In 2022, despite scandal and despite the heavy Scott Morrison factor, Tudge's primary vote was 43%. Now, that was still 5% above the Libs' Senate vote in Aston. So with the loss of a popular local member, and the selection of an outsider candidate without a local ballot, with Labor enjoying something of a strong honeymoon, running a negative campaign, of course, that the Libs didn't counter, or the lack of announceables of their own, a popular PM, of course, against an unpopular opposition leader that people still don't really know, it's not hard to see why Aston was lost. So where to now? That's the big question. First, forget the despair and bloodletting. That makes things worse, not better. Hard-headed analysis is what turns around fortunes, hard work too, and an understanding of history. Now, this isn't the first time the Liberals have been written off. They were written off after losing the unlosable 1993 election, Keating versus Hewson, only to triumph under John Howard in 96. In 2010, they had 4 leaders in 3 years. But Tony Abbott reduced a first-term Labor government to a minority rump, and after being out of office in every state and territory in 2008, Abbott won in a landslide in 2013. The problem for the Liberals right now is that while people are hurting, while the government's enjoying its honeymoon, they're yet to blame the Prime Minister for his broken promises. The real argument is not whether the Liberal Party should be less right-wing or more, it's whether the Libs have plausible policies to make people's lives better. Because as John Howard always said, politics is a contest, and you don't create a contest by echoing the other side. As for this claim from people like the Tasmanian Bridget Archer that the Liberal Party's gone too far right-wing, well, Archer, where's the evidence for that? At the 2021 Western Australian election, the Libs promised coal-fired power stations would close within 4 years. Now, that was stronger action on climate than state or federal Labor. In South Australia too, a left-wing Liberal and Premier Stephen Marshall was thrown out of office after just 1 term because the Liberals' base had abandoned them. At last year's Victorian election, the Libs promised to legislate a 50% emissions cut by 2030, again stronger climate action than Labor, as well as rolling over on Daniel Andrews' culture war. And at the recent New South Wales election, the Libs promised a 75% emissions cut by 2035, again stronger than Albanese. So how much good does moving to the left do them? Every time they have, and led of course by left-wing Liberal leaders, they've been walloped, suggesting that trying to out-Labor Labor is the last thing Liberals need if they want to win. Then of course there was last May's federal election where AUKUS aside and that last-minute super for housing policy, the Morrison government was basically a carbon copy of Labor, including on net zero and its refusal to back nuclear power. The Libs' last big win anywhere in the country was in 2013 under Tony Abbott, and he hardly won, did he, by moving to the left. Now, since then, sure, there's been another decade of leftist brainwashing in schools and universities. That's not been counted. Under the influence of union-led super funds, public companies have put promoting diversity and inclusion ahead of promoting market capitalism. The long march to the left through our institutions has only accelerated. The Libs have all but given up on tax reform and bloated government spending. Indeed, as we saw in the pandemic, they're almost as in love with big government as Labor. Now, all of this makes it harder to get the Liberal Party back on track. Harder, yet more urgent. But it doesn't mean that the job of Liberals is now to roll over and agree with Labor rather than get back to core Liberal values and be prepared to fight for them, come what may, to create, as John Howard says, a contest. Today's news poll shows a 2PP lead to Labor, 55 to 45, and with Peter Dutton 30 points behind Anthony Albanese as preferred PM. Now, that doesn't mean the Libs need a new leader or that they can't win the next election. It just confirms that all new opposition struggle in their first year and won't succeed until they become a clear alternative to the incumbent.